May 5th, 1945, 6 in the morning, in the Austrian Alps, on a hilltop overlooking the village of Itter, American soldiers and German Wehrmacht troops fought side by side against attacking Waffen-SS forces. Inside the medieval castle they defended, French VIP prisoners, generals who'd commanded armies, a tennis champion, all fighting together against fanatic SS troops who wanted them dead. This shouldn't have been possible. Americans and Germans were enemies. They'd been killing each other for 4 years across Europe and North Africa. Germans wearing Wehrmacht uniforms had fought against Americans from Normandy to the Rhine, and now they were fighting together, defending a castle full of French politicians and military officers, against other Germans? Yes, because by May 1945, the world had gone mad. Hitler was dead. The Third Reich was collapsing. Some Germans wanted to surrender. Others wanted to fight to the death. And in the chaos of those final days, impossible alliances formed. Alliances that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. Alliances that saved lives and created the strangest battle of World War II. Make sure you subscribe to our channel to discover more untold stories from history. The Battle of Castle Itter lasted only hours. 1 man died, a handful were wounded. Compared to the massive battles of the war, Normandy, Stalingrad, the Battle of the Bulge, it was tiny, insignificant. Except it wasn't, because the men fighting to defend that castle, if they'd died, would have changed the course of post-war France, would have altered European history. And the fact that Americans and Germans could fight together, even for a few hours, proved that even in the darkest times, humanity could transcend the madness of war. This is the story of Castle Itter. How a group of French VIP prisoners ended up in an Austrian castle. How they came to be defended by the unlikeliest alliance of the war. How a Wehrmacht major who rejected Nazism, an American tank commander who didn't care about politics, an SS officer who'd lost faith in Hitler, and French politicians who hated each other, all fought together for survival. And how, for a few hours on May 5th, 1945, the lines between friend and enemy blurred in a battle that shouldn't have happened. Castle Itter sits on a hilltop in the Tyrol region of Austria. The fortress was first documented in 1241, though something may have stood there since the 10th century. Medieval, stone walls, towers. Everything you'd imagine a proper castle to have. Over the centuries, it was rebuilt and renovated. In 1532, in 1878. By the 20th century, it had been converted into a hotel, a charming alpine retreat where wealthy tourists could enjoy mountain views and fresh air. In 1938, Nazi Germany annexed Austria in the Anschluss. Austria ceased to exist as an independent nation. It became part of the Greater German Reich, and Castle Itter, like everything else in Austria, came under Nazi control. In 1940, the German government leased the castle from its owner. For 3 years, it sat mostly unused, just another property in the Nazi Empire. Then, in February 1943, SS Lieutenant General Oswald Pohl, acting on orders from Heinrich Himmler, seized Castle Itter outright. The castle was placed under the administrative control of Dachau concentration camp, 90 miles away in Germany. But Castle Itter wasn't a death camp. It wasn't even a regular prison camp. It was something unique. A detention facility for high-profile prisoners. VIPs. Very important prisoners. People the Nazis considered too valuable to kill, too dangerous to free. People who might be useful as hostages or bargaining chips if the war went badly. By April in 1943, Castle Itter began receiving its first prisoners. And what prisoners they were. Former French prime ministers, generals who'd commanded French forces, politicians, labor leaders, a tennis champion, the sister of Charles de Gaulle. These weren't random people swept up in the Holocaust. These were the elite of French society, people who'd shaped France's policies in the 1930s, people who'd fought Germany or collaborated with it, people whose presence in German custody was meant to intimidate France and demonstrate Nazi power. But who were these prisoners? Let's meet them. Because understanding who they were makes clear why this battle mattered so much. Edouard Daladier, 60 years old in 1945, Prime Minister of France from 1938 to 1940. He'd signed the Munich Agreement in September 1938, the deal that gave Hitler the Sudetenland and supposedly guaranteed peace in our time. A year later, when Hitler invaded Poland, Daladier led France into war, but his government fell in March 1940, replaced after the disastrous Norwegian campaign. The Vichy regime arrested him in 1940, and eventually he was sent to German custody. Now he was at Castle Itter, bitter about how history would remember him. Paul Reynaud, 66 years old. He'd succeeded Daladier as prime minister in March 1940, right as Germany was preparing to invade France. Reynaud tried to rally France to fight, tried to organize resistance. But in June 1940, after the French military collapsed, his government fell. Philippe Pétain, who wanted an armistice with Germany, replaced him. Reynaud refused to collaborate with Vichy. He was arrested, sent through various prisons, eventually landed at Castle Itter, and he hated Daladier. The two former prime ministers, imprisoned together, could barely speak to each other without arguing. Maurice Gamelin, former commander-in-chief of the French army, the general who tried to stop the German invasion in May and June 1940. He'd failed spectacularly. The Germans punched through the Ardennes, encircled French forces, and drove to the English Channel in weeks. Gamelin was fired in mid-May 1940 and replaced by Maxime Weygand. The Vichy government blamed him for France's defeat. He was arrested, put on trial, eventually sent to Castle Itter, where he had to live with the man who'd replaced him and blamed him for everything. Maxime Weygand, 78 years old, one of France's most respected military officers. He'd replaced Gamelin as commander-in-chief in May 1940. But by then, it was too late. The French army was shattered. Weygand helped negotiate the armistice and initially supported the Vichy government. But he grew disillusioned. In 1942, trying to flee France, he was caught. The Nazis arrested him, and now he was at Castle Itter with Gamelin, the man he'd blamed for France's defeat. Jean Borotra, the bounding Basque, one of the world's most famous tennis players. He'd won Wimbledon twice in the 1920s, won the French Open multiple times, the Australian Open. He'd been a sports hero. After France fell, he became Vichy's commissioner for sport and physical education. But in April 1942, he resigned. He tried to flee France to join the Free French. He was caught, and the Nazis sent him to Castle Itter, a tennis champion imprisoned with politicians and generals. Marie-Agnès Caillot, sister of Charles de Gaulle, the leader of Free France. She'd joined the resistance, was captured. Her brother's name saved her from execution, but it also made her valuable to the Nazis. She was sent to Castle Itter in April 1945, right near the end of the war. The Germans might have planned to use her as leverage against de Gaulle. It never came to that. Léon Jouot, France's most prominent trade union leader, head of the Confédération Générale du Travail, France's largest union. He'd opposed both communism and fascism. That made him dangerous to the Nazis, who sent him to Buchenwald in 1943. But they decided he was more useful alive than dead. So he ended up at Castle Itter, where he couldn't stand François de la Roque, the right-wing politician also imprisoned there. François de la Roque, leader of the Croix de Feu, a right-wing nationalist movement in the 1930s, fiercely anti-communist. After France fell, he'd actually joined the resistance, which surprised many who thought he'd collaborate. The Nazis arrested him, and at Castle Itter, he and Jouot, the leftist union leader, ate at different tables to avoid fighting. Michel Clemenceau, son of Georges Clemenceau, France's prime minister during World War I, a politician in his own right, arrested by the Nazis and sent to Castle Itter. And there were others, wives and secretaries of the main prisoners, Eastern European prisoners from Dachau who did maintenance work. The castle housed perhaps 20 people total, living in converted hotel rooms, with adequate food, access to the library. They could walk in the courtyard. It wasn't Auschwitz. It wasn't even a typical concentration camp. But they were prisoners, and they knew that if Germany lost the war, the SS might execute them, rather than let them be liberated. Life at Castle Itter was peculiar. These high-profile prisoners, who in normal times would have been at each other's throats politically, were now confined together. And they mostly hated each other. Daladier and Reynaud barely spoke. Gamelin and Weygand blamed each other for France's defeat. La Roque and Jouot represented opposite ends of the political spectrum. They ate at separate tables in the dining room. Weygand and his wife at one table, Reynaud and his secretary at another, the neutrals at a third. The Germans who guarded them found this amusing. These supposed French patriots couldn't even get along in captivity. But the guards weren't cruel. The SS officers running Castle Itter treated the prisoners with a mixture of respect and disdain. They knew these were important people, so there was no torture, no starvation. The prisoners had books, decent food, and relative comfort. One prisoner even had a hidden radio and listened to BBC broadcasts. The guards knew. They didn't care. By 1945, many guards were just going through the motions, waiting for the war to end, not particularly invested in Nazi ideology anymore, just doing their jobs and hoping to survive. That dynamic would change dramatically in early May 1945, when the guards fled and the prisoners were left alone, surrounded by hostile forces, with no way to escape, and only days left in the war. April 30th, 1945. In a bunker in Berlin, surrounded by Soviet forces fighting house to house in the streets above, Adolf Hitler put a pistol in his mouth and pulled the trigger. The Führer was dead. The man who'd started this war, who'd sworn Germany would fight until victory or extinction, who'd promised a 1,000-year Reich, dead by his own hand rather than face capture by the Soviets. Hitler's death changed everything. Not immediately. The war didn't stop. Fighting continued across Europe. But psychologically, Hitler's suicide broke something. He'd been the center of Nazi Germany, the focus of all loyalty, the source of all authority. With him gone, what were German soldiers fighting for? For Admiral Karl Dönitz, Hitler's designated successor, most Germans had barely heard of Dönitz. For the Nazi Party? The party was collapsing. For Germany itself? Germany was being torn apart by Allied armies advancing from east and west. Some Germans still wanted to fight. Fanatical SS troops, die-hard Nazis who believed the propaganda about wonder weapons that would turn the tide. Young boys and old men drafted in desperation. They kept fighting, but many others just wanted the war to end. Regular Wehrmacht soldiers who'd seen enough death. Officers who knew Germany had lost and saw no point in throwing away more lives. Civilians who wanted the bombing to stop. They were ready for peace, even if it meant surrender, even if it meant occupation. This split, between those who wanted to surrender and those who wanted to fight to the death, created chaos in early May 1945. In some areas, Wehrmacht units surrendered en masse to American or British forces. In other areas, SS units shot anyone who talked about surrender. Summary executions of supposed defeatists became common. German soldiers didn't know if the Mon standing next to them would try to surrender or shoot them for cowardice. Towns didn't know if they'd be peacefully handed over to the Allies or turned into battlefields by fanatic SS holdouts. It was madness. Austria was particularly chaotic. The country had been absorbed into Germany in the Anschluss. Many Austrians had supported it initially, but by 1945, most Austrians wanted to distance themselves from Nazi Germany, wanted to claim they'd been victims, not accomplices. An Austrian resistance movement had grown. When Allied forces approached Austrian towns, resistance members tried to prevent SS troops from fighting, tried to arrange peaceful surrenders, tried to protect civilians from reprisals, and sometimes they succeeded, sometimes they were shot. In early May, American forces were advancing through the Tyrol region of Austria. The U.S. 7th Army pushed through the Inn River Valley. Small towns fell one after another. Some surrendered peacefully. Others saw brief firefights before the Germans withdrew or surrendered. The Americans expected some resistance from die-hard SS units, but mostly they encountered demoralized Wehrmacht troops happy to lay down their weapons and go home. Castle Itter sat in this chaotic region. The town of Virgil, 8 kilometers down the mountain, was occupied by German forces. The town of Innsbruck, 40 miles away, was being approached by American forces, and in the forests around Castle Itter, elements of the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division were operating. These were hardcore SS troops, fanatics, men who'd rather die than surrender, men who viewed anyone who talked about peace as a traitor, deserving execution. The SS troops knew about Castle Itter. New important French prisoners were there, and some SS commanders had orders. If Germany was going to lose, if there was no hope of victory, then kill the prisoners. Don't let them fall into Allied hands alive. Don't let them testify about their treatment. Don't let them become symbols of Allied victory. Kill them. That was the order some SS units received, and they intended to carry it out. The prisoners at Castle Itter knew this. They'd heard rumors. Whispers from guards who were less fanatic. Reports of massacres at other camps as the SS tried to destroy evidence before the Allies arrived. The prisoners knew that liberation might not save them. The SS might storm the castle and kill them all before American forces could arrive. So when the guards at Castle Itter began acting strangely in early May, the prisoners grew afraid. May 2nd, 1945. Something strange happened at Castle Itter. Edward Weiter, the former commandant of Dachau concentration camp, was staying at the castle. He'd fled Dachau as American forces approached, knowing what would happen if he was captured. The crimes committed at Dachau under his command guaranteed he'd be tried as a war criminal. So he'd run to Castle Itter, hoping to hide out until he could escape further. Weiter knew the war was lost. Hitler was dead. American forces were miles away. And he had no future. If the Americans caught him, he'd hang. If the SS found him fleeing, they might shoot him for cowardice. Either way, he was doomed. So, on May 2nd, in his quarters at Castle Itter, Eduard Weiter shot himself. The former Dachau commandant chose suicide rather than face justice. His death panicked the remaining guards. If the commandant killed himself, that meant the end was near. No point staying at a castle prison in the mountains when American forces might arrive any day. Better to flee while there was still time. Disappear into the civilian population. Claim they'd been forced to serve. Anything to avoid being identified as concentration camp guards. So, on May 4th, the remaining SS guards at Castle Itter abandoned their posts. They packed what they could carry, destroyed some documents, and fled into the mountains, leaving the prisoners alone in the castle, free technically, but trapped because hostile SS forces still controlled the area. If the prisoners tried to leave, they'd almost certainly be captured and killed, so they were free but not free, liberated but still in danger. The prisoners armed themselves with weapons the guards had left behind, rifles, a few submachine guns. They weren't soldiers, most were elderly men, but they could shoot if they had to. They set up defensive positions, barricaded doors, prepared for the worst. And they sent out 2 men to seek help. 2 prisoners who might be able to reach Allied forces and bring back rescue. The first was Zvonimir Chuchkovich, a Yugoslav communist resistance member who'd been sent to Dachau, then to Castle Itter to work as a handyman and electrician. He knew the area, knew the risks. On May 3rd, he left the castle on foot, supposedly running an errand for the prison commander. Instead, he headed toward Innsbruck, 40 miles away, through German-occupied territory, alone, hoping to find American forces before SS troops found him. Chuchkovich walked all day and into the evening, 40 miles through mountains, avoiding towns where German troops were stationed, following back roads and trails. Finally, late on May 3rd, he reached the outskirts of Innsbruck, and he found American troops, elements of the 103rd Infantry Division. He told them about Castle Itter, about the French VIP prisoners, about the SS forces nearby, about the desperate need for rescue. The Americans wanted to help, but Castle Itter was 40 miles away, in territory that was technically in another division's area of operations. And they didn't have authorization to send a rescue mission that far. But one American officer, Major John Kramers, decided to act anyway. He assembled a small force, heavily armed, in trucks and jeeps. And on the morning of May 4th, they set out toward Castle Itter, racing to reach the prisoners before the SS did. But they didn't make it. About halfway to Itter, near the town of Jenbach, the rescue force came under heavy artillery fire. German forces were still defending that area. The American vehicles couldn't advance. They took casualties. Major Kramers had to pull back. He radioed for instructions, and his superiors told him to stand down. Don't risk more casualties for a rescue mission that wasn't authorized. Withdraw. Let another unit handle it if they're in that area of operations. So, the rescue attempt failed. Chuchkovich had reached the Americans. He'd convinced them to try. But German forces stopped the rescue column. And now, the prisoners at Castle Itter were still trapped, still waiting, still hoping someone would come before the SS did. The prisoners at Castle Itter didn't know what happened to Chuchkovich. They didn't know if he'd reached American forces, didn't know if help was coming. So on May 4th, they sent out another man, Andreas Krobot, the castle's Czech cook. He volunteered to ride a bicycle to the nearest town and seek help from anyone he could find. Krobot had a problem. The nearest town was Würgl, 8 kilometers down the mountain, and Würgl was occupied by German forces, not SS, regular Wehrmacht, but still potentially hostile. Chuchkovich had avoided Würgl for exactly this reason, but Krobot decided to risk it. Maybe the Wehrmacht troops in Würgl were ready to surrender. Maybe they'd help. It was worth trying. Krobot rode his bicycle down the mountain roads, 8 kilometers, less than an hour. As he entered Würgl, he saw German soldiers, Wehrmacht uniforms, not SS black. That was promising. He asked around, looking for someone in authority, someone who might listen, someone who might help. And he found Major Josef Gangl. Sepp Gangl was 44 years old, a career Wehrmacht officer. He'd joined the German army in the 1920s, long before Hitler came to power. He'd fought in World War I as a young man, survived, built a military career between the wars. When World War II started, he did his duty, fought for Germany, commanded troops, was promoted to major. Nothing unusual, just another professional officer doing his job. But by 1945, Gangl had seen enough. He'd watched the war become increasingly brutal, watched the SS commit atrocities, watched Germany destroyed by Hitler's madness, watched the Wehrmacht, the professional army he'd served for decades, subordinated to fanatic, Nazi ideology. And he'd had enough. Gangl no longer believed in Hitler, didn't believe in the Nazi cause, didn't believe Germany could or should win this war. When orders came to rejoin SS units in late April, Gangl refused. It was an act of incredible bravery. Refusing orders in the Wehrmacht could mean execution, especially orders to join the SS in the war's final days. But Gangl didn't care anymore. He was done taking orders from Nazis. He'd made contact with the Austrian resistance in Würgl, become their military leader. And now he was protecting Würgl from SS reprisals, keeping the town from being destroyed in pointless last-ditch fighting. Gangl had maybe 20 Wehrmacht soldiers loyal to him, men who also didn't want to die for a lost cause. They'd surrendered to no one yet. Technically, they were still German soldiers, but they weren't fighting for Hitler anymore. They were just trying to survive the war's final days without getting killed by fanatic SS troops. When Andreas Krobot found Gangl and explained the situation at Castle Itter, Gangl immediately wanted to help. French VIP prisoners trapped in a castle, surrounded by SS forces who might kill them. Someone needed to rescue them before it was too late. But Gangl had a problem. 20 men wasn't enough. The SS had hundreds of troops in the area. If Gangl took his men to Castle Itter, they'd be outnumbered and overwhelmed. He needed more help, American help. So Gangl made a decision that could have gotten him shot. He grabbed a white flag, got in a vehicle, and drove toward American lines to find American forces and convince them to help rescue the prisoners at Castle Itter. A German Wehrmacht major, still in uniform, approaching American troops with a white flag to ask for help fighting other Germans. It was insane. But these were insane times. Gangl's gamble worked. He found elements of the U.S. 12th Armored Division, specifically Company B of the 23rd Tank Battalion, and he found their commander, Captain Jack Lee Jr., First Lieutenant John C. Jack Lee Jr., 27 years old, from Norwich, New York, a stocky, rough-talking, cigar-smoking tank commander, the kind of officer who led from the front, who didn't care much about military protocol or paperwork, who just wanted to get the job done and go home. Lee had been fighting across Europe since the Normandy breakout. France, Germany, now Austria. He was tired. Everyone was tired. The war was clearly ending. Nobody wanted to be the last man to die in a war that was already won. On May 4th, Lee was sitting on top of his Sherman tank, comparing his map to the Austrian countryside. Company B had been advancing for months, pushing deeper into Austria, meeting sporadic resistance. Most German units were surrendering without much of a fight, but occasionally they'd hit an SS unit that wanted to fight to the death. Those encounters could be brutal, so Lee stayed alert. Even though the war was winding down, you could still get killed if you weren't careful. When Major Gangl approached with his white flag, Lee was skeptical. A German officer wanting to talk, probably trying to arrange surrender. That was fine. Lee would accept a surrender. Gangl spoke some English, enough to explain the situation. Castle Itter. French VIP prisoners. SS forces planning to attack. They needed help. Could the Americans come? Most officers would have said no, would have referred Gangl to higher headquarters, would have waited for orders, would have worried about protocol, unauthorized missions into areas outside their operational zone, risking American lives for French prisoners in a German-held castle. Too many variables, too much risk. Lee said yes. Why? Maybe because he was the kind of officer who made decisions without overthinking them. Maybe because saving French VIPs sounded more interesting than sitting around waiting for the war to officially end. Maybe because he liked the idea of rescuing important prisoners. Or maybe because he saw Gangl as a German officer trying to do the right thing in an impossible situation. And Lee respected that. Whatever his reasons, Lee agreed to help. But Lee had a problem. He couldn't take his whole company. He'd left some of his tanks and men behind to secure other positions. And he couldn't wait for reinforcements. If the SS was planning to attack Castle Itter, time was critical, so Lee would take what he had, his own tank, 2 other tanks, their crews, a platoon of infantry, about 30 American soldiers total, plus Gangl's 20 Germans, and they'd have to move fast. Lee's tank had a name, Besotten Jenny. It was painted on the turret. Nobody knows for certain where the name came from. Besotten is an archaic word meaning drunk or intoxicated. Maybe it was an inside joke among the crew. Maybe Lee liked the sound of it. Doesn't matter. That tank, Besotten Jenny, would become famous for the role it played at Castle Itter. Lee organized his small force, 3 Sherman tanks, infantry and trucks. Gangl's Wehrmacht soldiers. They set out from Vergel toward Castle Itter, 6 kilometers up the mountain, through territory that might be hostile. But they had to try. The prisoners were depending on them. The column moved carefully. Lee knew the SS might have ambushes set up, might have roadblocks, might contest every kilometer. But the route was clear initially. They made good progress until they reached the first bridge, a wooden structure over a stream. The Sherman tanks were heavy, over 30 tons each. Would the bridge hold? Lee tested it carefully, sent infantry across first, then eased 1 tank onto the bridge. It held, barely. The wood creaked ominously, but the tank made it across. The second tank started across. The bridge gave way, collapsed. The tank didn't fall in the water, but now they had a problem. Only 1 tank had crossed. The other 2 were on the wrong side, and they couldn't repair the bridge quickly enough. Lee made a decision. Leave 2 tanks behind to guard the bridge and secure their line of retreat. He'd continue with just Besotten Jenny, 1 tank, his crew, some infantry, Gangl's Germans. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. The reduced column continued toward Castle Itter. A few kilometers later, they encountered another problem. A second bridge had been wired with explosives. The Germans had prepared to blow it, probably as a delaying tactic during their retreat. The explosives were still there. If the SS decided to detonate them, Lee's force would be trapped on the wrong side. Lee couldn't risk it. He ordered his 2nd Sherman tank, Boche Buster, to stay behind and guard the bridge. Don't let anyone blow it. That's our escape route. The crew of Boche Buster agreed. They'd hold the bridge no matter what. Now, Lee was down to Besotten Jenny, a handful of infantry, and Gangl's Wehrmacht soldiers, maybe 40 men total, 1 tank. That's what they had to defend Castle Itter against however many SS troops showed up. It wasn't enough. But Lee pressed on anyway, because turning back wasn't an option. A few kilometers from Castle Itter, they ran into SS troops, a squad trying to set up a roadblock. Lee didn't hesitate. Besotten Jenny's machine guns opened fire. The infantry dismounted and engaged. The firefight was brief. The SS troops were outnumbered and outgunned. They broke and ran. Lee's force continued forward, but now the SS knew someone was coming. New American forces were approaching the castle. If they were planning an attack, they'd have to move fast, before reinforcements arrived. Lee's small column reached Castle Itter on the afternoon of May 4th. The French prisoners came out to greet them. They were excited. Americans had arrived. They were saved. But when they saw how few Americans there were, their excitement turned to concern. Where was the rest of the relief force? Where were the reinforcements? You can't hold a castle with 1 tank and 40 men. The SS would overwhelm them. Lee explained the situation. This was all he had. More troops were coming, but it would take time. Meanwhile, they'd have to defend the castle with what they had. Was that acceptable? The prisoners didn't have a choice. At least Lee was there. At least they had some help. Better 1 American tank than nothing. Lee surveyed the castle's defenses. Stone walls? Good. A strong gate? Good. High ground? Good. But only 1 tank and 40 men to defend it? Not good. The castle might have been impregnable in medieval times. But this was 1945. The SS had modern weapons. Panzerfausts that could destroy tanks, machine guns, mortars, artillery. If they attacked in force, the defenders would be in trouble. But Lee had no choice. He positioned Basat and Jenny at the castle's main entrance. The tank's guns could cover the approach road. Infantry took up positions on the walls. Gangl's Wehrmacht soldiers did the same. And then Lee got a surprise. The French prisoners didn't want to hide in the keep. They wanted to fight. Former generals, former prime ministers, a tennis champion. All of them grabbed weapons from the abandoned armory and took up positions alongside the American and German soldiers. This was insane. Lee tried to order them to stay inside, stay safe, let the soldiers do the fighting. But the French VIPs refused. If the SS broke through, they'd be killed anyway. Better to fight. Better to die with a rifle in your hands than be executed cowering in a cellar. The Americans and Germans looked at these elderly Frenchmen with a mixture of respect and disbelief. Former generals who hadn't held weapons in years. Prime ministers in their 60s. All ready to fight. What kind of war was this? And then Lee got another surprise. An SS officer showed up, not to attack, to help defend. SS Hauptsturmführer Kurt Siegfried Schrader, an SS captain. He'd been wounded earlier in the war and sent to Castle Itter to recuperate. While there, he'd become friendly with the French prisoners. Not because he'd lost faith in Nazism initially, just because they were the only people around to talk to. And over time, talking to these educated, cultured French politicians and military officers, Schrader began to question everything he'd believed. These were the enemies? These elderly men who talked about literature and politics? These people Germany was supposed to hate? Schrader had joined the SS believing in Hitler's vision, believing Germany was fighting for survival against inferior races and Jewish conspiracies. But spending months at Castle Itter, interacting with the French prisoners daily, he couldn't maintain those beliefs. These people weren't monsters. They were just people, and they didn't deserve to die. By May 1945, Schrader no longer believed in the Nazi cause. He was still an SS officer, still wore the uniform, but he'd lost faith. And when the castle guards fled on May 4th, Schrader faced a choice. Leave, go home, try to disappear into the civilian population, or stay, help defend the prisoners, fight against his own side. Schrader chose to stay. He moved his family into the castle, wife and children. If he was going to defend the French prisoners, his family would be safer inside the castle than in their house nearby. And when Lee and Gangl arrived with their small force, Schrader pledged to help. An SS officer, fighting alongside Americans and Wehrmacht soldiers, against other SS troops. It was the ultimate betrayal of everything the SS stood for. And Schrader didn't care anymore. Lee accepted Schrader's help. Why not? They needed every man they could get. Didn't matter what uniform Schrader wore. If he was willing to fight the SS, he was welcome. So the defenders of Castle Itter consisted of American soldiers, Wehrmacht soldiers, an SS officer, and French VIP prisoners, the strangest collection of defenders in the entire war. And the night of May 4th into May 5th, they waited for the attack they knew was coming. May 4th evening. The defenders of Castle Itter prepared for battle. Lee organized the defense. Basat and Jenny at the main gate, guns pointed down the approach road. Infantry on the walls, machine gun positions covering the likely avenues of attack, ammunition distributed, fields of fire established. Everything by the book. Except nothing about this situation was by the book. The French prisoners were the biggest wild card. General Maxime Weygand was 78 years old. General Maurice Gamelin was 73. Edouard Daladier and Paul Reynaud were in their 60s. These weren't young men. These were elderly politicians and military officers who hadn't held weapons in years. Could they actually fight? Or would they freeze up when bullets started flying? Lee assigned them defensive positions on the walls, simple tasks, watch sectors, report enemy movement, shoot at targets the Americans identified, don't take risks. The professionals, the American and German soldiers, would do the heavy fighting. The French VIPs were backup, but Lee couldn't stop them from fighting if they wanted to. They were determined to defend themselves, to prove they weren't helpless prisoners waiting to be rescued, to show they still had the courage that had made France a great power. Jean Borotra, the tennis champion, was particularly insistent. At age 46, he was younger than most of the other French prisoners, athletic, fit. He grabbed a rifle and positioned himself on the wall like he knew what he was doing. Borotra had resigned from the Vichy government specifically because he opposed collaboration with Germany. Now he had a chance to fight Germans directly. He wasn't going to hide in the keep. The mood among the defenders was strange. The Americans were professional, tired but focused. They'd been in combat for months. This was just another battle. Win or lose, they'd do their jobs. The Wehrmacht soldiers were nervous. They were about to fight other Germans. Some might be friends, men they'd served with, brothers in arms for years. Now, enemies because of who'd stayed loyal to Hitler and who hadn't. That psychological burden was enormous. The French prisoners were excited and terrified. Excited because they were finally doing something after years of imprisonment. Terrified because they knew what would happen if the SS broke through. No mercy, no prisoners, just execution. The SS viewed them as traitors, as symbols of French weakness, as obstacles to be eliminated. If the defense failed, the SS would kill every French prisoner in the castle. No question. Schrader was conflicted. He was about to fight his own organization, the Waffen-SS. He'd sworn oaths of loyalty, worn the uniform with pride, believed in the cause. And now he was betraying everything, fighting alongside enemies against fellow Germans. His family was in the castle. If the SS won, they'd probably execute his children for his treason. The stakes couldn't be higher. Around midnight, the first probing attacks came, not the main assault, just reconnaissance. SS troops testing the defenses, trying to find weak points. They crept close to the castle under cover of darkness, threw grenades at the gate, fired bursts from their machine guns, testing the defenders' reactions, seeing how quickly they could return fire, looking for gaps in the perimeter. Lee's men responded professionally, fired back, drove off the probes. The message was clear, the castle was defended. It wouldn't be easy to take, but the defenders also learned something. The SS was out there, in the woods. Maybe 100 men, maybe more, and they were preparing for an assault at dawn. Everyone knew it. The probing attacks were just the opening act. The real battle would come with first light. Gangl tried to call for reinforcements. There was a telephone line running from the castle to Vergel. He got through to Alois Meyer, the Austrian resistance leader in town. "We need help. We need more men. Can you send anyone?" Meyer could spare 2 Wehrmacht soldiers who were with the resistance, and 1 teenage Austrian resistance fighter, Hans Waltel, 16 years old, armed with his father's hunting rifle, wanting to fight the Nazis. 3 people. That's all Meyer could send. The resistance was stretched thin, trying to protect multiple locations from SS reprisals. 3 reinforcements were better than nothing. They drove up to the castle in darkness and joined the defenders. So as dawn approached on May 5th, the defenders consisted of about 14 American soldiers, roughly 20 Wehrmacht soldiers under Gangl, 1 SS officer, Schrader, 1 teenage Austrian resistance fighter, and a dozen French VIP prisoners armed with rifles against them. 100 to 150 Waffen-SS troops, armed with machine guns, Panzerfausts, mortars, led by Oberfuhrer Georg Bochmann, men who'd rather die than surrender, men who viewed anyone defending the castle as traitors deserving death. The defenders were outnumbered 3 or 4 to 1. They had good defensive positions. They had 1 tank. They had the castle walls. But they were isolated, low on ammunition, no reinforcements coming that they knew of. If the SS attacked in force and pressed the assault, the defenders might not hold. It would come down to determination. Who wanted to win more? Who was willing to pay the price? And as the sky began to lighten in the east, signaling dawn on May 5th, 1945, the SS began their attack. 6 in the morning, machine gun fire erupted from the tree line. Dozens of SS troops emerged from the woods, sprinting toward the castle. Bullets chipped stone from the walls. The defenders returned fire, rifle shots, besotten. Jenny's machine guns roaring. The noise was deafening. The SS attack came from multiple directions, not just a frontal assault. They'd positioned troops to hit the castle from different angles, trying to divide the defenders' attention, trying to find a weak spot, trying to overwhelm the defenses through coordinated pressure. Lee was everywhere, running from position to position, directing fire, moving men to where they were needed most. His training as a tank commander showed. He understood battlefield geometry, understood where to apply force for maximum effect, and he knew how to keep soldiers focused under fire. Gangl commanded the Wehrmacht soldiers. His combat experience from years of war showed too. He kept his men steady, prevented panic, made sure they conserved ammunition. A professional officer doing his job even though he was fighting his own countrymen. The French prisoners surprised everyone. They fought, calmly, effectively. General Weygand helped man a machine gun position, firing controlled bursts. 78 years old, and he was fighting like a soldier. Daladier and Reynaud, who could barely speak to each other without arguing, fought side by side. Former prime ministers of France shooting at SS troops attacking their castle prison. Tennis champion Jean Borotra moved between positions, carrying ammunition, firing at targets. The elderly Frenchmen were proving they had more fight in them than anyone expected, but the SS was relentless. Wave after wave. They'd pull back, regroup, and attack again. They had enough men to rotate attackers, keep constant pressure, wear down the defenders. And they had heavier weapons. Mortars began falling inside the castle. Not many. The SS didn't want to destroy the castle, but enough to terrorize the defenders, to wound, to kill. One mortar round hit near where Schroeder's wife was taking cover. Brick fragments from the wall injured her. Not seriously, but it showed how dangerous the situation was. Even inside the castle, you weren't safe. Shrapnel could get you anywhere. The SS brought up their most dangerous weapon, an 88mm flak gun. This was anti-aircraft artillery adapted for ground use, incredibly effective against tanks and against stone walls. The gun crew positioned it where it had clear shots at the castle, and they opened fire. The first 88mm shell screamed toward besotten Jenny, Lee's tank, the defenders' most powerful weapon. If they destroyed the tank, the castle would be much harder to defend. The shell hit, tore into the Sherman's armor. Fire erupted. The radio man inside scrambled out, wounded but alive. Besotten, Jenny was destroyed, knocked out of action, burning at the castle gate. Losing the tank was a disaster. The Sherman's machine guns had been essential for suppressing SS attacks. Its armor had protected the gate. Now it was just a burning wreck, and the SS knew it. They pressed harder, sensing the defenders were weakening. Lee pulled his men back from the walls, concentrated them in stronger positions. He was preparing for the worst. If the SS broke through the gate, the defenders would fall back to the keep, the inner stronghold. They'd make a last stand there, fight from room to room if necessary. But he hoped it wouldn't come to that. The French generals, Weygand and Gamelin, approached Lee. What should we do? Lee told them the truth. Keep fighting. We're running low on ammunition. If reinforcements don't arrive soon, we'll be overrun. But fight until you can't fight anymore. The generals understood. They'd commanded armies. They knew what was at stake. They went back to their positions and kept shooting. And then Major Josef Gangl saw something that made him move without thinking. Former Prime Minister Paul Reynaud had taken a position on the wall that gave him a good field of fire, but it was exposed, and an SS sniper had spotted him. Gangl saw the sniper raising his rifle, saw Reynaud in the crosshairs, and Gangl ran. He sprinted across the exposed area, shoved Reynaud out of the way, took the bullet himself. A 7.92mm Mauser round through the head. Gangl dropped, dead instantly. The Wehrmacht major who'd defied Hitler, who'd joined the Austrian resistance. who'd approached American forces to ask for help, who'd fought alongside former enemies to defend French prisoners from SS fanatics. Dead, saving the life of a French prime minister he'd never met before yesterday. The defenders were devastated. Gangl had been a leader, a calming presence. His men respected him. Now he was dead. And they were running out of ammunition. The SS was preparing another assault. They could see it. Troops massing in the tree line, getting ready for one final push that would overrun the castle. This was it. This was the end. Unless reinforcements arrived in the next few minutes, Castle Itter would fall, and everyone inside would die. Jean Borotra, the tennis champion, made an offer. Let me try to reach Vergel. I'll vault the wall and run through the SS lines, get to the town, find the American reinforcements that must be coming, guide them back here. It's our only chance. Lee looked at this middle-aged tennis player, proposing to leap over a castle wall and run through an enemy-held forest to reach a town 8 kilometers away. It was insane. Borotra would probably be killed within minutes, but they were out of options. Go, Lee said. Godspeed. Borotra climbed to the wall, took a deep breath, and jumped. Jean Borotra landed on the other side of the castle wall. 46 years old, former tennis champion, winner of Wimbledon twice in the 1920s, now running for his life through a forest full of SS troops who wanted him dead. He ran, legs pumping, heart pounding. Behind him, the sound of gunfire intensified. The SS was launching another assault on the castle. He couldn't look back, couldn't slow down, had to reach Vergel, had to find reinforcements. The lives of everyone in Castle Itter depended on him making it. Borotra had been one of the greatest tennis players of his generation, the bounding Basque they'd called him, famous for his athletic style, his speed, his endurance. He'd won the French Open 4 times, the Australian Open twice, Wimbledon twice. He'd played Davis Cup for France, a national sports hero. And now, 2 decades after his tennis prime, those same athletic abilities were saving his life. He ran through the forest, zigzagging between trees. The SS must have seen him go over the wall, must have realized someone was trying to escape, trying to get help. They'd be searching for him, hunting him. If they caught him, they'd shoot him on the spot. No hesitation, no mercy. But Borotra had advantages. He knew these woods. He'd walked them during his years imprisoned at Castle Itter. The guards had let the prisoners exercise outside the castle walls sometimes, under supervision. Borotra had memorized the terrain, the paths, the clearings, where the streams were, how to navigate toward Vergel without using the main road. And he was fast, even at 46, even after years of imprisonment and inadequate exercise. The athlete in him hadn't died. His muscles remembered, his lungs remembered, and adrenaline did the rest. He ran like he was back on the tennis court, like his life depended on reaching the ball before it bounced twice. Because this time, his life really did depend on it. 8 kilometers to Vergel, 5 miles. For a trained athlete, maybe 30 minutes at a good pace. But this wasn't a running track. This was rough terrain, mountains, forests, and enemy soldiers everywhere. Borotra couldn't just run in a straight line. He had to stay hidden, move from cover to cover, listen for German voices, avoid patrols. It would take time. Back at the castle, the defenders were in desperate straits, ammunition running critically low, the SS preparing for what looked like the final assault. Lee was pulling everyone back toward the keep, the inner stronghold. They'd fight from there, room to room if necessary. But everyone knew what that meant. Once they were trapped in the keep, there was no escape. The SS would eventually break through. And then it would be a massacre. The French prisoners were calm, surprisingly calm. Men who'd commanded armies, men who'd led nations. They'd faced death before, knew what it looked like. General Weygand checked his rifle, made sure it was loaded, looked at General Gamelin, the 2 men who'd blamed each other for France's defeat in 1940, who'd barely spoken to each other at Castle Itter. They nodded at each other, a silent understanding. We'll die fighting, like soldiers, like Frenchmen, not begging for mercy from SS fanatics. Daladier and Reynaud did the same, the 2 former prime ministers who'd hated each other, who'd argued about everything, political rivals for years. They stood together now, ready to make their last stand, defending a castle in Austria, fighting alongside Americans and Germans against other Germans, It was absurd. It was heroic. It was very French. The Americans were down to their last magazines. Lee was rationing ammunition. Single shots. Only. No automatic fire unless absolutely necessary. Make every bullet count. The Wehrmacht soldiers were doing the same. Some were down to a handful of rounds. Gangl's death had shaken them. Their leader was gone. The man who'd convinced them to defect from the Reich. Who'd given them a cause worth fighting for. Dead saving a Frenchman. But they didn't break. They stayed at their positions. Kept fighting. Because what else could they do? The SS began their final assault. Over 100 troops, screaming, firing, throwing grenades. They'd suffered casualties during the earlier attacks. But they still had numbers. And they were fanatics. They'd fight until they won or died. No retreat, no surrender. Just relentless pressure until the defenders broke. Lee watched them come, measured the distance, waited, then gave the order. Fire. The defenders opened up. Every rifle, every machine gun. The few remaining Americans with automatic weapons. The Wehrmacht soldiers with their Mausers. The French prisoners with their captured rifles. Everyone shooting. Trying to buy time, trying to stop the assault, trying to survive just a few more minutes. And in Vergel, 8 kilometers away, Jean Borotra burst out of the forest, covered in sweat. Breathing hard, but alive. He'd made it. Somehow, incredibly, he'd run through 5 miles of SS-controlled forest without getting caught or shot. The tennis champion had completed the most important run of his life. He found American soldiers, the relief force that Major Kramers had assembled. They'd been waiting in Vergel, unsure of what to do. Their earlier attempt to reach Castle Itter had failed. Now they were regrouping, preparing to try again. When Borotra appeared, gasping, explaining the desperate situation at the castle, they understood. No more delays. No more waiting for orders. They had to move now. Borotra climbed into a jeep. He'd guide them back, show them the fastest route. The relief force consisted of tanks, half-tracks, trucks full of infantry. Elements of the 142nd Infantry Regiment, 36th Division. American firepower. Finally. The cavalry was coming. But would they arrive in time? Remember the 2nd Sherman tank? The one Lee had left behind to guard the bridge with the demolition charges? Boche Buster. Its crew had been sitting there for hours, guarding that bridge, listening to the sound of battle from Castle Itter echoing down the mountain, knowing their friends were fighting, knowing they couldn't help because their orders were to hold the bridge. The crew of Boche Buster was on edge. They'd heard the explosions, the sustained machine gun fire, the sound of the 88mm gun destroying Besatten Jenny. They knew the battle was going badly, but they had their orders. Hold the bridge. Don't let anyone blow it. That bridge was the only escape route for Lee's force. If it was destroyed, everyone at Castle Itter would be trapped. Around 9 in the morning, they saw movement on the road. German troops, SS, coming down from the direction of Castle Itter. The crew tensed. Were these SS forces trying to escape, or reinforcements heading to join the attack? Either way, the Sherman's commander made a decision. Open fire! Drive them off! Don't let them reach the bridge. Boche Buster's guns roared. The SS troops scattered. Some were hit. Others ran into the woods. The tank crew had held their position, protected the bridge. But now the SS knew Americans were there, knew the bridge was defended. If they wanted to reinforce their attack on the castle or cut off the defenders' escape, they'd have to deal with Boche Buster first. The SS didn't try again. They had enough problems at Castle Itter. Didn't need to fight another Sherman tank defending a bridge. They pulled back, disappeared into the forest. And Boche Buster's crew breathed easier. The bridge was safe. For now. When the relief force from Vergel approached the bridge, guided by Jean Borotra, they found Boche Buster still there, still guarding. The crew was overjoyed to see reinforcements. Finally help was coming. The relief force didn't stop. Tanks rolled across the bridge. Infantry trucks followed. They were moving fast, racing toward Castle Itter, racing to save the defenders before it was too late. Back at the castle, the situation was critical. The SS had reached the gate. They were right up against the walls, throwing grenades over, preparing to blow the gate with Panzerfausts. The defenders were almost out of ammunition. Lee had pulled everyone back into the keep. The French prisoners were there, the American soldiers, the remaining Wehrmacht troops, Schrader and his family, all crammed into the inner stronghold, waiting for the gate to blow, waiting for the SS to pour through, preparing for hand-to-hand combat, the final stand. And then someone heard it, a sound from outside, different from the battle noise. Engines, heavy engines, lots of them. Someone looked out a window, saw something on the approach road. Tanks, American tanks, coming up the road at full speed, and behind them, trucks full of infantry. The relief force had arrived. The SS heard it too, turned, saw the American tanks bearing down on them, saw the infantry dismounting, saw 50 caliber machine guns opening fire. The SS attack faltered, broke. The troops who'd been about to overrun the castle suddenly found themselves caught between the defenders inside and a company of American armor outside. They were the ones surrounded now. They were the ones outnumbered. The American tanks opened up with everything they had: machine guns, main guns, high explosive shells crashing into the SS positions. Infantry advanced with rifles and bars. The SS troops broke and ran, scattered into the forest. Some tried to fight, were cut down, others fled. Within minutes, the battle was over. The SS attack had collapsed. The relief force had arrived just in time. Inside Castle Itter, the defenders couldn't believe it. They'd been seconds from being overrun, seconds from the final assault. And now, it was over. The Americans had won. They'd survived. Somehow, impossibly, they'd survived. Lee walked out of the keep, covered in dust and blood, exhausted. He saw Captain John Kramers, who'd led the relief force, walking toward him. Lee grinned, said something like, "What kept you?" And both men laughed. The kind of laughter that comes from surviving something you thought would kill you. The kind of laughter that's half relief and half hysteria. The French prisoners emerged, looking around at the carnage, at the SS dead in the courtyards, at the destroyed besotten Jenny, at the American tanks that had saved them. General Weygand shook Lee's hand, thanked him. This young American captain had saved their lives, had fought when he could have withdrawn, had held when he could have surrendered. Weygand had commanded French armies. He knew valor when he saw it, and Lee had shown uncommon valor. But there was one man who wouldn't see the victory, who'd given his life to make it possible. Major Josef Gangl. His body was carried inside. The Wehrmacht major who'd defected from the Reich, who'd joined the Austrian resistance, who'd fought alongside Americans against his own countrymen, who'd died saving a French prime minister. The defenders, American and German and French, stood over his body, honoring him. This man had been the bridge between enemies, the proof that even in war, even in the madness of Nazi Germany's collapse, some men could choose the right side, could choose honor over loyalty to an evil regime. The SS didn't try to attack again. They'd lost too many men, lost their momentum, lost the battle. American forces were flooding the area now. By afternoon, the region was secure. The French prisoners were safe. The strangest battle of World War II was over. May 5th, evening. The French prisoners were evacuated from Castle Itter. American trucks took them to safety. Away from the Austrian Alps, away from the SS forces that still roamed the area. They were finally, truly free. After years of imprisonment, after hours of combat, they were going home. On May 10th, 5 days after the battle, the French prisoners reached Paris. They were greeted as heroes, survivors, men who'd endured Nazi captivity and lived to tell about it. But they knew the real heroes were the men who'd defended Castle Itter, the Americans and Germans who'd fought together, who'd held out until reinforcements arrived, who'd saved their lives. Captain Jack Lee Jr. was promoted to captain and awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, America's second highest military decoration for heroism in combat. The citation praised his leadership, his courage, his willingness to take on a dangerous mission to save French VIPs. Lee downplayed it, said he was just doing his job. But everyone who'd been at Castle Itter knew better. Lee had been extraordinary, had made decisions that saved lives, had fought brilliantly with limited resources against superior numbers. Lee survived the war, went home to New York, lived a quiet life, died in 1973 at age 55. He never sought publicity for Castle Itter, never wrote a book, never gave interviews trying to glorify what happened. He was a soldier who'd done his duty. That was enough for him. Major Josef Gangl never got to see Germany surrender, never got to see Austria freed from Nazi control, never got to see the peace he'd fought for. He died on May 5th, shot by an SS sniper while saving Paul Reynaud, but Austria remembered him, honored him as a national hero. A street in Virgil was named after him, a memorial erected, because Gangl represented the best of what Germans and Austrians could be. A man who rejected evil even when it came from his own government, who chose the right side even when it cost him everything. Gangl left behind a wife and children. They received his military pension, but more importantly, they received the knowledge that their husband and father had died honorably, fighting for something that mattered, saving innocent lives. That legacy meant more than any pension. SS Hauptsturmführer Kurt Siegfried Schrader was arrested after the battle. The Americans took him into custody. He was an SS officer, had to be interrogated, investigated, checked for war crimes. Schrader explained what he'd done, how he'd lost faith in Nazism, how he'd helped defend the French prisoners, how he'd fought alongside Americans against other SS troops. The Americans verified his story. The French prisoners testified on his behalf, said Schrader had protected them, had treated them well during his time at Castle Itter, had risked his life defending them during the battle. Based on that testimony, Schrader received a lenient sentence, 2 years in prison for his Nazi Party affiliation. But the sentence was shortened in recognition of his actions at Castle Itter. He was released early, lived the rest of his life in Germany, died in 1995. A man who'd been on the wrong side of history, but found the courage to switch sides when it mattered. The French prisoners went on to shape post-war France. And this is why the Battle of Castle Itter mattered far beyond the small scale of the fighting. These weren't random prisoners. These were the men who would rebuild France, who would determine its political direction, who would shape its role in Europe for decades to come. Édouard Daladier returned to French politics, served in the National Assembly, wrote his memoirs, defended his record as prime minister during the Munich Agreement and the start of the war, died in 1970, age 86, a controversial figure in French history, but a survivor, a man who'd endured Nazi captivity and lived to tell his version of events. Paul Reynaud also returned to politics, served in the National Assembly, held various ministerial positions, wrote extensively about the fall of France in 1940, died in 1966, age 87. He and Daladier never reconciled their political differences. Even after fighting side by side at Castle Itter, they remained rivals, but they'd proven they could work together when survival demanded it. General Maurice Gamelin lived until 1958, spent his post-war years defending his military record, arguing that the defeat of France in 1940 wasn't his fault, that he'd been undermined by politicians, that he'd made the best decisions possible with the forces available. History has been mixed in its judgment of Gamelin, but he survived the war, survived Castle Itter, got to make his case. General Maxime Weygand lived until 1965, age 98, the oldest of the Castle Itter prisoners. He remained controversial because of his role in the Vichy government, but he'd fought at Castle Itter, had helped man the machine gun positions, had shown that even at 78, he was still a soldier, still willing to fight. Jean Borotra lived until 1994, age 95, the tennis champion who'd made the impossible run through SS-controlled forest to bring back reinforcements. After the war, he returned to tennis administration, promoted the sport in France, became a respected elder statesman of French tennis. But he never forgot Castle Itter, never forgot the day he'd run for his life to save his fellow prisoners. The other French prisoners also survived and returned to their various roles in French society. Marie-Agnès Caillot, de Gaulle's sister, reunited with her famous brother. Léon Jouot continued his work with the trade union movement. François de la Roque returned to politics. Michel Clemenceau carried on his father's legacy. All of them shaped post-war France in different ways, and all of them would have died if the defense of Castle Itter had failed. That's why the battle mattered, not because of the number of casualties. Only one defender killed, Major Gangl, a few wounded, some SS dead. small numbers compared to the massive battles of World War II, but the potential consequences of failure were enormous. If the SS had overrun Castle Itter and executed the prisoners, France would have lost men who played crucial roles in its reconstruction. The political landscape of post-war France might have been completely different. The Battle of Castle Itter was unique in World War II. It's often called the only time Americans and Germans fought together during the war. That's not quite accurate. There was one other instance, Operation Cowboy, a mission where American soldiers and German veterinarians worked together to rescue valuable horses from a Czech breeding farm. But Castle Itter was different. It was combat, real fighting, life and death. Americans and Germans fighting side by side against other Germans in a proper battle. Why was this so rare? Because in World War II, the lines between friend and enemy were usually clear. Americans fought Germans, British fought Germans, Soviets fought Germans. There weren't a lot of gray areas. You were on one side or the other. Switching sides was treason. Fighting your own countrymen was unthinkable for most soldiers. But the final days of the war created chaos, created situations where the normal rules broke down. German soldiers who'd lost faith in Hitler but hadn't formally surrendered yet. American forces advancing through areas where some Germans wanted to fight and others wanted to give up. Austrian resistance fighters trying to protect their communities from SS reprisals. French prisoners caught between liberation and execution. All of these factors came together at Castle Itter. The battle showed that even in the most brutal war in human history, alliances could form across enemy lines. That shared humanity could overcome political and military divisions. That Americans and Germans, who'd been killing each other for years, could fight together if they had a common cause. In this case, defending innocent prisoners from SS fanatics. The battle also showed the split within Germany itself. Wehrmacht versus SS. Professional soldiers versus Nazi fanatics. Men who just wanted the war to end versus men who wanted to fight to the last bullet. That split had been growing throughout the war's final months. Castle Itter brought it into sharp focus. German soldiers fighting other German soldiers because they couldn't agree on whether to surrender or resist. And the battle showed something about the French prisoners. These were elderly men, politicians and generals who hadn't been in combat for years, men in their 60s and 70s. They could have hidden in the keep, could have let the soldiers do all the fighting. Nobody would have blamed them, but they chose to fight, chose to defend themselves, chose to prove they weren't helpless victims waiting to be rescued. That pride, that courage, that refusal to surrender without a fight. It was very French. It was very human. The battle lasted only hours, from dawn on May 5th until the relief force arrived around mid-afternoon. Maybe 8 or 9 hours of actual fighting, with the most intense combat in the final hour. But those hours contained all the drama, heroism, and moral complexity of the entire war compressed into one small Austrian castle. Let's consider the counterfactual. What if Captain Lee had said no to Major Gangl? What if he'd followed orders and not led a rescue mission to Castle Itter? What if the defense had failed and the SS had overrun the castle? What would have happened? The SS would have executed every French prisoner, no question. These weren't men who took prisoners. These weren't men who showed mercy to people they viewed as traitors and enemies of the Reich. The French VIPs would have been lined up and shot, or hanged, or killed in whatever brutal way the SS commanders ordered. And their bodies would have been left at Castle Itter as the SS retreated. American forces would have found the bodies days later, would have documented the massacre, would have added it to the long list of SS war crimes. The perpetrators would have been hunted after the war. Some would have been caught and tried, others would have escaped, but the prisoners would still be dead. What would that have meant for France? Daladier and Reynaud dead. The two former prime ministers who, despite their differences, represented continuity with France's pre-war Third Republic. Their deaths would have removed two major political voices from post-war debates about France's future. Gamelin and Weygand dead. Two of France's most prominent military officers, men whose experiences in World War II shaped French military thinking for decades. Their loss would have created a vacuum in French military leadership and institutional memory. Jean Borotra, dead. France's most famous tennis player and a symbol of French sporting excellence. His death wouldn't have changed policies, but it would have been a cultural loss. Marie-Agnès Caillot, dead. Charles de Gaulle's sister. Her death wouldn't have affected her brother's political career directly, but personally, de Gaulle would have been devastated, would have blamed the Nazis, would have carried that grief and anger into his leadership of post-war France. All the other prisoners dead, men who went on to serve in the National Assembly, who wrote influential memoirs, who shaped France's labor policies, who participated in European integration. Their contributions to post-war France would have been lost. Would France have collapsed without these men? No. Other leaders would have emerged. Other politicians would have filled the roles. But France would have been different. The specific policies, decisions, and directions these men influenced would have been made by other people with different views. The trajectory of French politics in the late 1940s and 1950s would have changed in ways we can't predict, but would have been significant. And there's another consideration: the symbolic importance of their survival. These French VIPs endured Nazi captivity and lived to tell about it. They were symbols of French resistance and survival. Their return to France was a morale boost, a sign that France would rebuild with the leadership of men who'd suffered under Nazi occupation and emerged intact. If they'd been massacred at Castle Itter, that symbolism would have been lost, replaced by another example of Nazi brutality, another reason for grief rather than hope. So, yes, the Battle of Castle Itter mattered. The small scale of the fighting didn't diminish its importance. Sometimes history turns on small moments, small battles, small decisions by individual people. Lee deciding to lead the rescue mission, Gangl deciding to approach American forces, Borotra deciding to run for reinforcements. Each of those decisions mattered, changed outcomes, saved lives. The Battle of Castle Itter raises fascinating moral questions. Questions about loyalty, betrayal, duty, and courage that don't have simple answers. Consider Major Gangl. He was a German officer, sworn to serve Germany. For decades, he'd been a professional soldier, fighting for his country, following orders, doing his duty, and then he refused, defied orders to rejoin the SS, joined the Austrian resistance instead, approached American forces to ask for help, fought against German SS troops. Is that heroism or treason? From the Nazi perspective, Gangl was a traitor. He'd violated his oaths, turned against his own country, collaborated with the enemy. The SS would have executed him if they'd caught him. And by Nazi standards, they would have been right to do so. Gangl had betrayed everything the regime stood for. But, from the Allied perspective, Gangl was a hero. He'd rejected an evil regime, chosen humanity over loyalty to Hitler, risked his life to save innocent prisoners, died protecting a French prime minister from an SS sniper. He was exactly the kind of German the Allies hoped would emerge, someone who could see that loyalty to Hitler wasn't the same as loyalty to Germany, that serving the Nazi regime was itself a betrayal of German values. So, which perspective is right? Both. Neither. The answer depends on what you think soldiers owe their countries. Is it absolute obedience to whoever's in charge? Or is there a higher duty to morality and justice that transcends national loyalty? Gangl chose the latter. History has judged him well for it. But making that choice in May 1945, when the war wasn't officially over yet, when he was still technically a German officer, took extraordinary courage. Consider the American perspective. Captain Lee took his men on an unauthorized rescue mission, left his assigned position, went outside his unit's operational area, risked American lives to save French prisoners from German SS forces, all without explicit orders from higher command. If the mission had failed, if his men had been killed, Lee would have been court-martialed, relieved of command. His career would have been destroyed, but the mission succeeded, so Lee got promoted and decorated instead. That's often how military leadership works. Bold decisions that succeed are called courageous. The same decisions, if they fail, are called reckless. Lee was lucky. Lucky the defense held. Lucky reinforcements arrived in time. Lucky no Americans died in the battle. If the outcome had been different, we'd remember him differently. Does that make Lee's decision right? Or just successful? That's a harder question. Military officers are supposed to follow orders, maintain discipline, not run off on unauthorized missions because they think it's the right thing to do. If every officer did what Lee did, armies would fall apart. Chaos would reign. But if no officer ever took initiative, ever bent the rules to do what's right, opportunities would be missed. Lives would be lost that could have been saved. The military has to balance these imperatives, follow orders, but also use judgment. Don't be reckless, but don't be so cautious that you miss opportunities. Lee found that balance, maybe by instinct rather than calculation, but he found it, and people lived because he did. Consider SS Hauptsturmführer Schrader. He was an SS officer, a member of the organization responsible for the Holocaust, for war crimes across Europe, for atrocities that shocked the world. And yet, at Castle Itter, Schrader fought alongside Americans and French prisoners against other SS troops. Does that redeem him? Can one good action erase membership in an evil organization? The answer is complicated. Schrader wore the SS uniform, took the oaths, served the regime. For that, he bears responsibility. The Americans were right to arrest him after the battle, to investigate him, to charge him for his Nazi affiliations. But his actions at Castle Itter mattered too. He could have fled with the other guards on May 4th, could have just gone home. But he stayed, protected the prisoners, fought to defend them. That showed he'd changed, that he'd lost faith in the Nazi cause, that he could choose to do the right thing even though it meant betraying his organization. The French prisoners testified on his behalf, said he should be treated leniently because of his actions. That testimony mattered. The people he'd helped, the people whose lives he'd protected, thought he deserved consideration. So, he got a reduced sentence, not absolution, not a free pass, but recognition that his actions at Castle Itter counted for something. And consider the French prisoners themselves. These were men who'd shaped France's policies in the 1930s, who'd made decisions that led to France's defeat in 1940. Daladier signed the Munich Agreement, which emboldened Hitler. Reynaud presided over France's collapse. Gamelin commanded French forces during their worst military defeat. Weygand helped negotiate the armistice that put Vichy in power. Were they heroes or failures? Both. They'd failed in their duties to prevent France's defeat, but they'd also resisted Vichy collaboration, refused to work with the Germans, endured years of imprisonment rather than compromise their principles. And when SS troops attacked Castle Itter, they fought. They earned the right to be judged on their full records, not just their worst moments. These moral questions don't have simple answers. That's what makes the Battle of Castle Itter so fascinating. It wasn't a straightforward good versus evil confrontation. It was complicated, messy, full of people who'd been on different sides making temporary alliances because circumstances demanded it. That's more realistic than Hollywood portrayals of war. That's more human. We've talked a lot about the officers, about Lee and Gangl and Schrader, about the French VIPs. But what about the regular American soldiers who fought at Castle Itter? Who were, they? What did they think about this strange battle? The American troops at Castle Itter were from Company B, 23rd Tank Battalion, 12th Armored Division. They'd been fighting across Europe since late 1944, had seen action in France, Germany, and now Austria. They were veterans, experienced, tired. Like every American unit in Europe in May 1945, they just wanted the war to end so they could go home. When Lee told them they were going to rescue French prisoners from a castle, their reaction was probably mixed. On one hand, rescue missions sound heroic, sounds like something from a movie. On the other hand, rescue missions are dangerous, and the war was almost over. Nobody wanted to be killed in the last days of fighting. Nobody wanted to be the last American casualty in Europe, but they went. Because Lee was their commander and they trusted him. Because soldiers don't get to pick which missions they go on. Because it was their job. The tank crews climbed into their Shermans. The infantry mounted their trucks. And they followed Lee toward Castle Itter, not knowing what they'd find. Not knowing they were about to fight alongside German soldiers. Not knowing they were about to defend French prisoners they'd never met. Not knowing they were about to participate in the strangest battle of World War II. When they reached the castle and met Major Gangl's Wehrmacht troops, the American soldiers had to process something that went against everything they'd been trained to believe. These are the enemy. We've been killing them for months, and now we're fighting alongside them? What? But the Americans adapted. Because they could see Gangl wasn't a fanatic, could see his men weren't Hitler Youth true believers. These were just German soldiers who wanted the war to end, who'd defected from the Reich, who were willing to fight SS troops to save French prisoners. Okay, strange situation, but okay, we can work with this. The American soldiers respected Gangl. He was a professional officer, knew tactics, kept his men steady under fire, didn't panic when things got bad. The Americans could recognize competence when they saw it. Nationality didn't matter if someone knew what they were doing in combat. When Gangl died saving Paul Reynaud, the American soldiers mourned him. This German officer who'd approached them with a white flag less than 24 hours earlier, who'd fought beside them through the night and into the morning, who'd taken a bullet meant for a French prime minister. He was one of them now, part of the defenders of Castle Itter, and they honored him as such. The American soldiers were also impressed by the French prisoners. These old men who picked up rifles and fought, who didn't hide in the keep like Lee ordered, who stood on the walls shooting at SS troops. 78-year-old General Weygand helping man a machine gun. Former Prime Minister Reynaud taking pot shots at Germans from the parapet. Jean Borotra vaulting the wall to run for help. The Americans had expected to rescue helpless elderly politicians. Instead, they found fighters. People with pride and courage who refused to go down without a battle. That earned respect. After the battle, the American soldiers went back to their units, continued advancing through Austria, were there when Germany officially surrendered on May 7th, eventually went home. Most of them probably never thought Castle Itter was that significant. Just another firefight, another day in the war. They didn't know the French prisoners would become important post-war politicians, didn't know historians would call it the strangest battle of the war. For them, it was just what happened on May 5th, 1945. But they'd been part of something unique, had fought alongside former enemies to save innocent lives, had proven that humanity could transcend the madness of war, that Americans and Germans could cooperate when they had a shared purpose. That's worth remembering. Those regular soldiers, whose names we mostly don't know, whose personal stories haven't been told, were heroes too. They followed Lee into an insane situation and did their jobs professionally. That's what being a soldier means. We've talked about the defenders, but what about the attackers, the SS troops who assaulted Castle Itter? Who were they? What motivated them to fight in the war's final days when Germany had clearly lost? The SS forces that attacked Castle Itter were from the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division, specifically elements under the command of Oberfuhrer Georg Bachmann. These were Waffen-SS troops, combat soldiers, not concentration camp guards, not administrators, men who'd been fighting on the front lines throughout the war. By May 1945, the Waffen-SS was a shadow of its former strength. The division had been chewed up in battles across the eastern and western fronts. Casualties had been horrific. Replacements were young, poorly trained, or old men who'd never expected to see combat. Equipment was scarce, ammunition limited. The division was barely functional as a fighting force, but the SS had something regular Wehrmacht units often lacked by this point: fanaticism, belief in the Nazi cause. Many SS troops still thought they were fighting for Germany's survival, still believed Hitler's propaganda about wonder weapons that would turn the tide, still thought surrender meant Germany's destruction and their own execution as war criminals. So they kept fighting, kept resisting, even when it was hopeless. When these SS troops learned about Castle Itter, about the French VIP prisoners held there, some commanders saw an opportunity: kill the prisoners before the Americans arrived, deny the Allies their propaganda victory, show that the SS would fight to the bitter end. It was spite, revenge, a desire to hurt the enemy even in defeat. The SS couldn't win the war, but they could still inflict pain. The SS, troops who attacked the castle on May 5th, were following orders. Attack. Kill the prisoners. That was their mission. Some probably believed it was necessary, that these French traitors who'd collaborated with the Germans earlier in the war, then turned against them, deserved death. Others probably just followed orders without thinking much about it. That's what soldiers do. Someone tells you to attack a castle, you attack a castle. When they discovered Americans and Wehrmacht soldiers defending the castle together, the SS troops must have been furious. Germans defending French prisoners alongside Americans? This was the ultimate betrayal. This proved Germany had gone soft, had lost its will to fight, had been corrupted by defeatism and cowardice. It justified everything the SS believed about the need for fanaticism, about how only true believers could be trusted, about how anyone who questioned Hitler was a traitor. So the SS attacked with particular fury. This wasn't just about killing French prisoners anymore. This was about punishing German traitors, about showing what happened to Wehrmacht soldiers who collaborated with the enemy, about making an example of Major Gangl and his men. The SS didn't just want to win. They wanted to annihilate, but they failed. The defense held. Reinforcements arrived, the SS attack collapsed, and the SS troops fled into the forests. Some probably escaped, blended back into the civilian population, claimed they'd been regular Wehrmacht, avoided prosecution. Others were captured by American forces advancing through the area, interrogated. Some identified as war criminals, some tried and punished. The fates of individual SS troops who attacked Castle Itter are mostly unknown. What we do know is this: they failed. Their mission to kill the French prisoners failed. Their attempt to punish German defectors failed. Their hope that fanaticism and brutality could overcome determination and courage failed. And 2 days after the Battle of Castle Itter, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The SS ceased to exist as an organization. The Third Reich collapsed, and the cause these SS troops had fought for was revealed as evil and bankrupt. There's no heroism in the SS story at Castle Itter, no redemption. They were the villains of this tale. Fanatics attacking innocent prisoners, shooting at people trying to save lives, killing Major Gangl when he tried to protect Paul Reynaud. The SS represented everything dark about Nazi Germany, everything the war was fought to destroy, and at Castle Itter, they lost. That matters. Sometimes the good guys win, sometimes courage and decency triumph over fanaticism and hatred. Castle Itter was one of those times. The Battle of Castle Itter wasn't well known for decades after the war. It was a small engagement, lasted only hours, involved relatively few troops. It got overshadowed by the massive battles everyone remembers. Normandy, Stalingrad, the Battle of the Bulge, the Siege of Berlin. Castle Itter was a footnote, an odd curiosity that military historians mentioned occasionally, but most people had never heard of. That changed in 2013 when Stephen Harding published The Last Battle, a comprehensive book about Castle Itter. Harding researched archives, interviewed survivors and their families, pieced together exactly what happened on May 5, 1945. The book brought attention to this forgotten battle, showed how remarkable it was, how it represented something unique in the war. The book reached new audiences. People who'd never heard of Castle Itter learned the story. Historians reassessed its significance. Popular history websites and YouTube channels covered it. The battle entered popular consciousness as one of the strangest events of World War II, as proof that even in the most brutal war in history, impossible alliances could form. In 2016, the Swedish power metal band Sabaton released a song about the battle, The Last Battle. It dramatized the events, turned the story into an epic metal anthem about Americans and Germans fighting together. The song introduced Castle Itter to a younger generation, to people who might never pick up a history book but love Sabaton's music. Suddenly, 20-somethings around the world knew about this obscure Austrian battle from 1945. Castle Itter itself still stands. You can visit it. The castle is on a hilltop above the village of Itter in Tyrol. It's privately owned now. Not open for regular tours, but it's there, stone walls scarred from machine gun fire. The gate where Besatten-Jenny made its last stand. The walls where American and German and French defenders fought side by side. The keep where they prepared for their last stand. All still there. A physical reminder of what happened on May 5th, 1945. In Vergel, the nearby town where Major Gangl had been based, there's a street named after him, Josef Gangl Strasse, a memorial to the Wehrmacht Major who defected from the Reich, who joined the Austrian resistance, who died saving a French prime minister. Austria remembers Gangl as a hero, as someone who proved that not all Germans were Nazis, that some chose resistance, chose honor, chose to do the right thing even when it cost them everything. The story of Castle Itter has become a teaching tool, Military academies use it to discuss tactical decision-making under pressure. Ethics courses use it to explore questions about loyalty, duty, and moral choices in war. Leadership courses use it to examine how Lee, Gangl, and others made decisions in chaotic circumstances. The battle has value beyond its military significance. It's a case study in human behavior under extreme stress. But perhaps the most important legacy of Castle Itter is simple: hope. The battle showed that even in the darkest times, even in the midst of humanity's most brutal war, people could transcend their divisions, could work together across enemy lines, could choose courage and decency over hatred and fanaticism. That's a message every generation needs to hear. 79 years have passed since the Battle of Castle Itter. The world has changed dramatically. The soldiers who fought there are all dead now. The French prisoners they defended are all dead. The Austria and Germany of 1945 don't exist anymore. So, why should we care about this battle today? Why does it still matter? Because the questions it raises are timeless. When is it right to disobey orders? When does loyalty to one's country conflict with loyalty to universal human values? Can enemies become allies if circumstances change? How do ordinary people make moral choices under extreme pressure? These questions didn't stop being relevant in 1945. They're just as important today. Consider Major Gangl's choice. He was a German officer who'd sworn oaths to serve Germany, but he decided those oaths didn't obligate him to serve Hitler's evil regime. He defected, joined the resistance, fought against other Germans. We honor him for that choice. Call him a hero. But what's the principle we're endorsing? That soldiers should follow their conscience over their orders? That personal moral judgment trumps institutional authority? That's a dangerous principle if applied universally. We can't have soldiers deciding for themselves which orders are legitimate and which aren't. Armies would fall apart. But we also can't have soldiers blindly following orders without any moral responsibility for their actions. That's what the Nazis claimed at Nuremberg. I was just following orders. We rejected that defense, said individuals are responsible for their choices even in war. So, where's the line? When should a soldier be like Gangl and refuse to follow orders? When should they obey even if they have doubts? There's no easy formula, no clear rule. It requires judgment, conscience, a willingness to take responsibility for your choices. And those qualities are just as necessary today as they were in 1945. Consider Captain Lee's choice. He went on an unauthorized mission, risked American lives to save French prisoners, ignored the normal chain of command and rules of engagement. We celebrate that choice because it worked. But what if it hadn't? What if Lee had gotten his men killed on a reckless mission? Would we still call him a hero? Or would we call him a reckless cowboy who got people killed for no good reason? Leadership requires taking risks, making decisions without perfect information, sometimes bending or breaking rules to do what seems right. But it also requires responsibility, accountability, recognition that your choices have consequences for other people. Lee got that balance right at Castle Itter. But not every officer does. Not every bold decision succeeds. Understanding that tension, that balance between initiative and responsibility, is crucial for leaders in any field. Consider the alliance itself, Americans and Germans fighting together. Would that have been possible 6 months earlier? Probably not. The war was still raging. Germany was still fighting. The lines between friend and enemy were clear. But in May 1945, in the chaos of Germany's collapse, those lines blurred. Temporary alliances became possible. Former enemies could cooperate if they shared an immediate goal. That happens in our world too. Not just in war, in business, politics, international relations. Sometimes former rivals have to work together. Sometimes you have to ally with people you don't trust or like because you have a common enemy or goal. The question is, can you do it effectively? Can you put aside your prejudices and past conflicts long enough to accomplish something together? The defenders of Castle Itter proved it was possible. And consider the French prisoners, elderly men who could have just hidden, could have let others do the fighting, could have been passive victims waiting for rescue. But they chose to fight, chose to defend themselves, chose agency over helplessness. That's a choice everyone faces at some point, maybe not in combat, maybe not in life or death situations, but the choice between action and passivity, between fighting for yourself or accepting whatever happens. The French VIPs chose action, and they survived because of it. The Battle of Castle Itter matters because it shows us the best of what humans can be: courage in the face of overwhelming odds, moral clarity in confusing circumstances, the ability to transcend tribal loyalties when something more important is at stake, cooperation across enemy lines when lives depend on it. These aren't just historical curiosities. These are virtues we need in every generation. May 5th, 1945, a small castle in the Austrian Alps, one of the last battles of World War II in Europe, and one of the strangest. Americans and Germans fighting together, defending French VIP prisoners against SS fanatics, a Wehrmacht major dying to save a French prime minister, a tennis champion running through enemy lines to bring back reinforcements, a tank named Besotten Jenny destroyed protecting a castle gate, elderly French politicians manning machine guns alongside young American soldiers. It shouldn't have happened. The circumstances that made it possible were insane. The collapse of Nazi Germany, Hitler's suicide 4 days earlier, the split between Wehrmacht soldiers ready to surrender and SS troops determined to fight to the death, Austrian resistance fighters trying to prevent a bloodbath, French VIPs who'd been imprisoned for years suddenly facing execution just days before liberation, an American tank commander willing to risk his men on an unauthorized rescue mission, a German major willing to betray his oaths to save innocent lives. All of these factors came together at Castle Itter, created a battle that makes no sense if you try to fit it into normal patterns of World War II combat. Americans and Germans were enemies. They'd been killing each other across Europe for years. And then suddenly, they were allies, fighting together, dying together, winning together. The battle lasted hours. One man died, Major Josef Gangl, the Wehrmacht officer who chose the right side, who proved that even in Nazi Germany, even in the darkest moments, some men could reject evil, could choose honor over loyalty to a criminal regime, could make the ultimate sacrifice protecting people who'd been enemies just days before. His death wasn't in vain. The defense held. Reinforcements arrived. The French prisoners survived, went home to France, went on to shape post-war European politics. The lives saved at Castle Itter rippled through history in ways we can measure and ways we can't. That's how history works. Small moments, small decisions, small battles that turn out to matter more than anyone realized at the time. Captain Jack Lee Jr. went home to New York, lived a quiet life, never sought fame for what happened at Castle Itter, just a soldier who'd done his job. But his job involved making decisions that saved lives, involved showing moral courage and tactical skill under pressure, involved creating one of the most remarkable alliances in military history. That's worth remembering. The French prisoners went home. Daladier and Reynaud, Gamelin and Weygand, Borotra and the others. They returned to a France that had been liberated while they were imprisoned. That had moved on without them, but they still had contributions to make, still had roles to play. And they played them, shaped France's reconstruction, defended their records and reputations, lived long lives, all because a small group of American and German soldiers held a castle for a few hours on May 5th, 1945. The Battle of Castle Itter proved something important, that even in the most brutal war in human history, humanity wasn't dead, that people could still choose courage over cowardice, could still choose cooperation over tribal hatred, could still choose to do the right thing even when it was dangerous, even when it went against everything they'd been taught about who was friend and who was enemy. World War II is remembered for its massive battles, for the millions who died, for the Holocaust and other atrocities that shocked the world, for the reshaping of global politics that followed. Those are the big stories, the ones everyone knows. But sometimes it's the small stories that matter most. The strange moments that don't fit the pattern, the unexpected alliances and acts of courage that show what humans are capable of when circumstances demand it. The Battle of Castle Itter is one of those small stories, a footnote to the massive war, an odd curiosity that's hard to fit into conventional narratives, but it's worth remembering, worth telling, because it shows that even in war, even in the collapse of civilization, people can still choose to be better than their circumstances demand, can still fight for what's right, even when the outcome is uncertain, can still risk everything to save strangers who moments before were enemies. On May 7, 1945, 2 days after the Battle of Castle Itter, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. The Third Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years had lasted 12. Hitler was dead. The SS was destroyed. Nazi Germany was gone. And the soldiers who'd fought at Castle Itter, American and German, French and Austrian, could finally go home. They'd participated in something unique, something that shouldn't have been possible according to the normal rules of war and national loyalty. They'd proven that impossible alliances can form when they need to, that former enemies can fight together if they have a common cause, that humanity can transcend hatred if people choose courage. That's the legacy of Castle Itter. Not the small casualty figures or the brief duration of the fighting, not even the tactical details of how the defense was conducted. The legacy is the idea that even in the darkest times, people can still make the right choices, can still work together across seemingly unbridgeable divides, can still show that humanity, courage, and decency are stronger than fanaticism, hatred, and despair. The strangest battle of World War II. The last battle for many of the soldiers who fought there. A battle that shouldn't have happened but did. A battle that showed the best of what humans can be, even in the worst of circumstances. That's worth remembering. That's worth telling. That's worth honoring even 79 years later. Because the questions raised at Castle Itter on May 5th, 1945 are still with us. When do we fight? When do we cooperate? When do we follow orders and when do we refuse? When do we risk our lives for strangers? When do we choose honor over loyalty? These are eternal questions. And the defenders of Castle Itter, American and German and French, gave us one answer. Through their courage, through their sacrifice, through their willingness to transcend the madness of war and fight together for something that mattered. May we remember them. May we learn from them. And may we find that same courage when our moment comes. When our choices matter, when we have to decide whether to follow the easy path or the right one. The defenders of Castle Itter chose the right path, and because they did, lives were saved, history was changed, and we have a story worth telling about what humans can do when they rise above hatred and fear and choose courage instead. The last battle, the strangest battle, and in its own way, one of the most important. Not because of what was won or lost on the battlefield, but because of what it proved about human nature, about our capacity for good even in the midst of evil, about our ability to work together even when everything tells us we should be enemies, about our courage when faced with impossible odds and certain death. That's the story of Castle Itter. Remember it, tell it, learn from it, because its lessons are timeless, and its heroes, from every nationality and every walk of life, deserve to be remembered for what they did on that hilltop in Austria when the world was ending and they chose to make one small part of it better.